Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Executive Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Transformative Encounters, with the 2022 Lloyd Artist in Residence, Audrey Bell. The Lloyd Library was founded in the 1870s by three brothers, the Lloyd brothers, who collected books from around the world to aid their research and production of nature-based medicine. With books going back to the 1400s, the collection from the start integrated illustration, science, and medicine. It's a perfect match that the 2022 Artist in Residence is a medical illustrator. During her time at the Lloyd, Audrey researched Ohio flora and fauna, interspecies interactions, and the ways they had been documented through herbaria, botanical illustration, mapmaking, and text. Audrey is a medical illustrator, painter, and printmaker based in Detroit. She earned her master's in medical arts from the University of Dundee and has created illustrations and animations for the Teaching Hospital in Dundee, the Royal College of Surgeons of England in London, and Oakland University William Beaumont School of Medicine, among others. She is a professional member of the Association of Medical Illustrators, and prior to coming to the Lloyd, she was the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. Please join me in welcoming Audrey Bell.
Hi.
Hi, Audrey.
Thank you. All right. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Hi, I'm Audrey, and I did my residency at the Lloyd this March. So I've been working on this project for the past 6-ish months. In this talk, I'm going to discuss my professional and artistic work and sort of what led me to this project at the Lloyd. And then I'll go over my experience working with the collections at the Lloyd. And then finally, I'm going to go over the process of creating the actual artwork. So as Patricia mentioned, I'm a medical illustrator primarily, and for anyone sort of unfamiliar with that line of work, medical illustration is basically the visual interpretation and representation of medical and anatomical concepts. So I work with doctors, scientists, academics, the public to create what I think of as sort of visual translations of medical and health-related topics. So this can mean observing a surgery and drawing the steps so that surgeons in training can understand the procedure. This can mean interpreting, very small scale molecular processes so that to help people sort of envision something that they can't see with their eyes. It can mean designing an infographic that helps patients understand the care they're receiving. So while I do all of that, and sometimes my work is a little bit more interpretive, much of it is drawing from observation, either through surgery or dissection, which is a really good fit for me. I've always really enjoyed careful and precise drawing and just getting to spend hours really carefully looking and recording the details. So the previous slide was sort of a figure drawing I made and then laid over the muscular structure that's underneath the skin. These are two illustrations I made from dissection. So even when I was in grad school for medical art, I knew that I was interested in scientific illustration more broadly. I was able to work with the Darcy Thompson Museum in Scotland, which housed a collection of an early 20th century biologist who's also known for this book called On Growth and Form, pages of which are on the right of this slide, so lots of different diagrams. I loved working with the specimens at the museum, as well as just sort of taking in the aesthetics of those illustrations and the display cases and these sort of old exhibit designs. I think they're kind of scary and problematic in some ways, but are also like quite visually compelling. So I created the poster on the right, which basically shows the development of the spine as mammals moved as animals moved out of water onto land, back into water, into the air, and how that affected the structure of the spine. After grad school, I moved to Detroit and started working as a medical illustrator. I moved there in November, so the first few months of living there were a little bit of a shock. I'd never experienced a Michigan winter before. And I'd also never really lived in a big city. So it was easy to feel very distant from anything green or anything not man-made. So I started going for these walks and collecting things around my neighborhood and making illustrations of the plant life around my neighborhood. And it sort of became this exercise of noticing interactions with non-human life, even in a big city. Then the pandemic hit, and like a lot of people, I had a lot more time on my own and without anywhere to go. And I did a lot more walking around my neighborhood and really paying much more attention to the weather and the sky, and sort of like having these experiences of making drawings that felt like they were about sort of the multiple scales of experience we can inhabit at the same time, from the deeply personal to, you know, being aware of being in a global pandemic or the climate crisis. And these experiences made me realize that I wanted to create more opportunities to integrate science, illustration, and my art practice, and to figure out how to explore and process scientific information, but in a more maybe personal and visual way, as I sort of felt like I was doing with those botanical illustrations and the sky drawings. I often felt like my artistic skills were sort of in service of the science, which is a wonderful thing. But I think I wanted to explore ecological issues through a more sort of personal or artistic lens, and sort of deepen my engagement with that kind of work. So when I discovered the residency at the Lloyd, it sort of seemed like this perfect combination of those things. I could explore the collections at the Lloyd, learn a lot more about science or ecological issues, but also sort of create my own artistic project around it that I got to define the parameters of. So in developing the project at the Lloyd, I knew that I wanted to focus on botanical illustration. And, you know, drawing on that experience I had at the Darcy Thompson Museum in Scotland, I knew that I was interested in those aesthetics of those traditional European botanical illustration. But I also wanted to be very self-aware, or, you know, recognize the context of those aesthetics. As a medical illustrator, I try to be very careful about thinking about how the way that we process an image is very much defined by our cultural context and our personal histories. And so I think one of the jobs of an illustrator is to be very intentional about how we depict things like bodies or various medical scenarios, and be very inquisitive about how our own assumptions and biases are playing into the images that we're creating. So there's a lot of ethical considerations there. And I think the same is true of botanical illustration. It's so easy in looking at a science illustration or something that is created in that aesthetic style. It has a way of sort of conferring objectivity or truth onto its subject matter. So it's easy to look at a science illustration, I think, and assume that it's real or true. And the history of medical illustration has all sorts of issues with that. And so while I knew that I was attracted to this aesthetic of these traditional botanical illustrations, I also was thinking about how it reflected and enforced a particular hierarchy developed mostly by European men in the 1800s. So yeah, I was interested in the history of these kinds of images, how they fostered inquiry and understanding of our world, but also were used as tools in colonization, resource extraction, violence, and also enforcing a very specific scientific framework. And I wanted to treat those aesthetic choices not as neutral, but to explore what they were sort of inferring about our world and also sort of projecting or putting forth about our world and our relation to it as humans. And so for much of the same reasons, I knew that I was interested in exploring herbaria and like the aesthetics of herbaria, but also how these species were collected. And then lastly, in coming to the Lloyd, I knew that I wanted to make use of Curtis Gates Lloyd's mycology resources, which I knew were abundant. At the time, I was reading Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And I think, like most people who stumble into the world of mycology for the first time, I was really fascinated by mushrooms and the ways that they challenge sort of individualized concepts of the self, taxonomy, and yeah, just Western scientific frameworks more generally. So I decided to bound the project by the state of Ohio, which was still an enormous undertaking. I probably could have honed that down a little bit more, but it was a place that I knew hardly anything about. So I spent my month at the Lloyd researching Ohio and sort of, with this idea of placefulness. So, what happened here, the historical, and then who or what lives or lived here. And I guess also how that has been documented by the resources at the Lloyd. And then I chose a few species to depict visually. So that was sort of what happened with the project. I wanted to create illustrations, as Patricia said, that were sort of focused on entanglement and interdependency of human and non-human species, not in a particularly like utopian or harmonious sense, but in a way that doesn't sort of step back and separate human life from the rest of life on this planet, or non-human species from each other. So I was interested in, these entanglements that Anna Singh was talking about, and also her idea of like plantation mindset, and like how species get separated from their context. She says, she's a quote, in popular American fantasies and sciences, survival is all about saving oneself by fighting off others. at the heart of neoclassical economics and population genetics is a self-contained individual actor set out to maximize personal interests. But staying alive for every species requires livable collaborations and acknowledgement of our vulnerability to others, both human and non-human. So, building off of these ideas, I spent the first couple of weeks at the Lloyd just reading. It's a library, it has an incredible abundance of resources. So got to learn so much about botanical illustration and herbaria, about the ecological history of Ohio, and about specific species and their relationships to each other. So this is just like a page from my notes. I collected so much information on creatures and events and ideas that never actually made it into the final artwork, but was just sort of part of the process of building those kind of webs of interactions. And there was really a feedback loop between the reading I was doing about plants and the other reading that I had ongoing and like leading into the project when I was sort of building it in my head. I think especially as I learned more about mushrooms and lichens, I found new insights into all this other reading, including Sarah Ahmed's ideas about use, usefulness, uselessness, Jack Halberstam's writings on queerness and failure, and Donna Haraway's ideas of situated knowledges. So basically that all knowledge comes from a positional perspective, and that position sort of defines what we can even know. So those maps of species slowly got refined, if a bit tangled, and then refined again. And I basically settled on 3 groupings of species to make illustrations of, and they were loosely organized around 3 ecosystems. So I sort of had a forest group, a prairie group, and a wetlands group. At this point, I was able to start focusing a little more on the artistic practice, artistic process, and gathering references for what the illustrations were actually going to look like, both, illustration style, composition, how I was going to lay all these species out and have them sort of interacting visually. I made a lot of sketches and drafts. I think, it was a challenge in like having all these incredible resources at the Lloyd, because there's just so many beautiful illustrations that are taking so many different approaches aesthetically. And yeah, I really just had like a wealth of inspiration, but it also made it hard to narrow in and make choices about how things were going to look. It was also a challenge making these illustrations because I am very much used to drawing from observation. So basically having a specimen in front of me and being able to look at it very closely, look at it from different angles, light it however I wanted, look at it with a magnifying glass or botanical loupe if need be. And that was just not going to be an option with this project. I was working in a library, not a forest or a wetland, and I also wanted to sort of embrace that and use the library resources as best I could, or emphasize that. So Erin and Betsy and Christine at the library were able to just pull amazing resources off the shelves, take me up into the rare books collection, where I got to see all of these incredible botanical illustrations going back hundreds of years, down to the archives to delve into, all these topics and species that I decided to focus on. So in making the illustrations, I was able to reference these historical illustrations of the same species, some of which were just incredibly beautiful. I also was able to visit the herbarium. Much of the specimens from the Lloyd's collections were donated to herbaria, including the University of Ohio. And so we were able to go over, and Dr. Eric Tepe took me around and just like pulled endless folios off of the shelves and just helped me find all of these species I was interested in, and just spend hours looking at them and photographing them, some of which were collected in the 1800s. And I also just found many of them to be so aesthetically just lovely. So I think hopefully it's clear how I was able to make the illustrations directly from the reference illustrations or the herbarium samples. And I also utilize other interesting resources at the Lloyd, such as C.G. Lloyd's glass mycology slides. So these are the hand-tinted glass slides of mushrooms from the turn of the century. So yeah, again, you could see how this sort of combination of the glass slides, the illustrations, these historic botanical illustrations, and the specimens at the herbarium all sort of came together to in my own illustration of this particular mushroom. I also gathered a huge collection of reference images and information online, just sort of giving myself lots of reference points for creating the illustrations. And I think that ultimately the illustrations do have a much more illustrated or generalized look to them. They are not a drawing of a particular individual. They're much more generalized. And yeah, that was just a very different way for me to make images than I'm used to. So I finalized the sketches, digitized them, and then carefully painted them in gouache. So that was the process, and that whole sort of making process of these illustrations took about 4 months. So I wanted to take you all through one of the illustrations to hopefully give a better sense of how I chose these groupings and sort of the conceptual framework and background research, and yeah, how I sort of like made these groups of entanglements that I wanted to communicate. So this is from the Wetland illustration, and at the center is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, which is an orchid that was formerly widespread in prairies and wetlands east of the Mississippi, but its population has declined more than 70% due to wetland drainage and the conversion of wetlands to agricultural land. So at this point, Ohio has lost about 90% of its wetlands. Like all orchids, it's dependent on a fungal or mycorrhizal symbiosis for survival. A really amazing example of how fungi challenge our ideas of individuality, or even being able to label or define individual species scientifically. Its seeds are dependent on the fungus for energy. In this case, a strain of Ceratobasdium. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these scientific terms. As mycologist Patricia Kashian writes, quote, over 90% of plants form these mycorrhizal associations, and myceliated landscapes sustain cascades of nested biological systems from which every evolutionary layer of our human biology is indistinguishable. Fungal transindividualism is our collective ecological history. End quote. And so in addition to this symbiosis, fungi are also essential to wetlands for nutrient cycling, for decomposition, filtration. The specific species that I illustrated are Mitrula or swamp beacon, and they sort of glow at night. The Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid is also dependent on this sphinx moth for pollination. It's a solitary nocturnal pollinator, which feeds on the orchid's nectar. And while it is essential in this environment, it is considered a pest in vineyards. So I found it interesting to include something that has a very specific role in relation to humans, but a very different role in a non-human context. And there's some bioluminescent fungi that attract night-flying insects. So that was kind of an interesting connection. In 1859, the Ohio General Assembly authorized the construction of what was called drainage districts to drain the Great Black Swamp, which was a wetland area of about 1,500 square miles in northwestern Ohio that existed since the end of Wisconsin glaciation about 10,000 years ago. It was a forested swamp with ash, cottonwoods, sycamore. It also had an abundance of wild grasses and rice, vast diversity of waterfowl and fish, and also just sort of served as this giant filtration system for Lake Erie. But with the construction of the drainage districts, it was completely drained and deforested by 1920 and converted into agricultural lands. So that was like a huge part of this wetland research that I did. Much of Ohio in the land that has been converted to agriculture is planted with soybeans, specifically Roundup Ready soybeans, which have been produced by Monsanto since the 90s. And we're now seeing these super weeds that are resistant to Roundup, specifically these amaranth species. And I found specimens of those at the herbarium in Cincinnati. And I was also interested in the connection of how these monocultures basically create the perfect conditions for fungal parasites to thrive. As is, I think, pretty common knowledge at this point, runoff from these agricultural areas with no wetland filtration in place has led to frequent toxic algal blooms in Lake Erie and other drinking water in Ohio. And so I included a specimen of green algae. This particular one was collected in Collins' Phycotheca borealis americana in 1895, which was an early collection of North American algae. And this algae is found across the world. Green algae is also a photobiont for most lichens, which were included in other illustrations that I made. And then we have this snail, the white-lipped globe snail. It feeds on algae and fungi, and like fungi, challenges some of our binary ideas around gender and sexuality. So this was sort of the web of species interactions that were present in the wetland illustration. And here is that final illustration of those species. So I don't have time in this talk to go through all of the illustrations in the same level of detail, but I'll just describe them briefly. This is the prairie grouping. There are a lot of death and decay themes in this one, as well as species that are considered weeds and pests. These prairie ecosystems developed in Ohio during what's called the xerothermic interval, which was basically a period of very dry climate about 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, which encouraged the development and growth of drought-tolerant prairie species. And the climate continued to change, and forests moved in and sort of pushed out these prairies, but these pockets of grasslands were maintained by humans through controlled burning for thousands of years. At this point today, it's estimated that 99% of Ohio's prairies are gone. And I don't know that there's any areas where these sort of intact plant communities still survive, but there are specific species that have survived, including little bluestem, which is the grass on the left-hand side of the illustration, native grass. It provides food and habitat for many animals and insects, especially during the winter. Sort of following the ideas of things pushed to the margins. On the right hand, we have shepherd's purse. It's largely considered a weed and tends to grow on like the edges of sidewalks and parking lots. But it is also a food source for many creatures, including humans, and has been used medicinally for pain and sores and to staunch bleeding. Much of the land that was grassland has been converted to agricultural land. So I wanted to include this grasshopper, a major agricultural pest. It's one of the most common grasshopper species in Ohio, and thrives in grasslands, urban areas, marginal areas like vacant lots. And these grasshoppers are very strong flyers and can swarm and destroy an entire grain crop in a matter of days. I have two mushrooms. There's on the left, and I think mushrooms in general are sort of associated with death and decay. The one on the left is the netted stinkhorn. It can emerge from underground and achieve its full size in a matter of hours, and is covered with this carrion scented slime to attract insects to carry its spores elsewhere. And then on the right is the shaggy ink cat, which is a member of the Caprinus genus, which produce fruiting bodies on animal dung. In fact, there's been individuals of this species found on fossilized woolly mammoth dung, and it releases its spores through this process of autolysis. So basically the cap decays and releases these amazing sort of dripping elements that allow it to reproduce. This mushroom is also edible, and it's a bioaccumulator of heavy metals, including cadmium and mercury and arsenic. So it can basically clean those heavy metals from the soil. I also wanted to include pawpaw because I believe it's the only native North American fruit tree. Like the netted stinkhorn mushroom, it releases this carrion scent to attract pollinating flies. It is becoming more abundant in Ohio because it seems that deer don't like to graze on it, and deer populations are expanding. They prefer to graze or forage on other trees. So it's sort of getting this comeback, but at the same time, the Forest Service is trying to suppress pawpaw growth because they don't want it to sort of outcompete these valued timber species. And lastly, we have the nightcrawler worm. It's presumed native to Western Europe, but is now distributed across the world. There are no native worms north of the glacial boundary in North America. And so these creatures have had a huge impact on atmosphere, soil quality, biodiversity, water flow in soil. And I think scientists are still uncovering what their long-term effect will be. And then this is the forest grouping. There is estimates that Ohio used to be about 95% forest. I think there's like that story that a squirrel could cross the whole state or like multiple states in the Northeast without touching the ground. And there's many early European accounts of these sort of open park-like forests that were controlled by fire or maintained by fire. Around 1830, the charcoal iron industry emerged. That required 80 to 250 hectares of forest to be cleared per year per furnace. And then this was repeated 20 to 30 years later as whenever there was regrowth of the forest. So forest cover in Ohio went from 95% to about 10% by 1890. And by 1920, there were basically no areas that have been left uncleared. Those iron seams were eventually depleted, and the last furnace closed in 1906. And today it's estimated that about a third of the state is forested. So in the center of the illustration, the leaves are shagbark hickory, which has been a dominant species with oak since the last ice age. It's a mass tree, meaning that it doesn't release the same amount of fruit every year. It sort of waits, and then as collective releases this abundance, sort of this interesting indication of complex communication within the species. On the right, there's this caterpillar called the hickory horned devil. The shagbark hickory is the larval host plant for this caterpillar, which becomes the regal moth. On the bottom left is the Indiana bat. It's been on the endangered species list since 1967 due to habitat loss. It hides its pups under the peeling bark of the shagbark hickory. And these bats also like to hibernate in abandoned mines, which I thought was sort of an interesting use of, these things that both destroyed the habitat, and also is sort of this interesting interspecies, they're making use of these spaces. In the center of the illustration are two kinds of lichen, which grow on hickory. They provide food and habitat to all sorts of insects. The ruffle lichen in the middle is used by ruby-throated hummingbirds in combination with spider webs to make their nests. And they do all sorts of nutrient and moisture balancing in forests. And for anyone who doesn't know about lichens, they're another sort of fascinating fungal symbiosis. All lichens are composite organisms, so an algae or cyanobacteria does the photosynthesizing, and then the fungus does the sort of reproduction, spore release, and provides the structure to the plant. And in the bottom, there is the split gill mushroom. It's a type of white rot that is essential to breaking down wood and recycling nutrients across the world. This mushroom is found on every continent except Antarctica, and it can dry up and rehydrate. It's edible, and it also has more than 20,000 different mating types. So yeah, kind of an amazing mushroom. And then in the lower right, there's bloodroot. It's one of the earliest spring ephemera in the forest, ant dispersed, and it's also been used medicinally by humans for at least hundreds of years. The eclectics were very interested in its uses for pneumonia. So here they are all together. I hope that wasn't just like a complete overload of information, but this is what the illustrations look like as a group, along with some of the text that I just shared. And then I don't have time to go into the second half of the project in a ton of detail, but I also made this whole series of maps to accompany the illustrations. I'm really interested in maps. I think, I came across so many of them during my research, and I think it's clear, they have been used to allow for exploration of this area, and also for a very, a specific human group to use this land in a very specific and often destructive way. And so I think they help in sort of asking some of those placefulness ideas of, what happened here, who and what lives or lived here. And then I also think that I was interested in making the maps because I think that making and reading maps is something that we do when we're lost and trying to find our way. And I think this is a time when a lot of people feel sort of lost and overwhelmed by the complexity of what we're experiencing as a species and as a planet. And I think that art making in general can sort of be thought of as a map making endeavor. So I thought that conceptually it sort of made sense to create some maps in this project, and aesthetically I just think they're really, really nice. So I was able to go down into the archives with Christine and just look at all these incredible maps in the Lloyd's collection. I think some hadn't been unfolded for 100 years, and when we opened them, all this soot fell out from like when the library was heated by coal furnaces. So yeah, got to explore some amazing collections of the Lloyd, and then just pulled so many resources from the internet. US Department of Agriculture, Library of Congress, Forest Service, various like agricultural newsletters, all sorts of resource management, historical documents online. And I just feel like overall, you know, these maps kind of captured this feeling of living in an incredibly complex system that has all these different, there's just like so many layers to what's happening. And I think that it can make us feel like we're living in this very complex global network of all of these inputs. And can kind of deprive us of a sense of like living in a specific place, because there is so much coming and going and weaving in and out. And I think at the same time, it becomes clear, especially through the climate crisis, that like we live in a very specific place, which is planet Earth, and we, you know, our dependence on this place is complete. We need these specific oceans and this specific atmosphere and these specific nutrients and life forms. This, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this is like part of the map making process. We have major rivers and lakes of Ohio. The Great Black Swamp, the original area of that swamp, is shown in gray. The pink, the light pink, is areas that are now 75 to 100% agricultural land. Areas that have toxic algae in the drinking water are shown in that dark yellow. The purple or magenta is original areas where people think grasslands were in Ohio. And then I also included information on the maps about mound builder activity, which was red and blue, just because I wanted to emphasize that the pre-colonization history and land use that happened here. So these are the three maps that go with illustrations all together. And I wound up including a timeline as well at the bottom of each of the maps, just because there was just so much information that had to get left out of the project, but that I wanted to include in some way. And then these are the pairings. So this is the forest pairing. The map includes those mines I was talking about. The like orange and red circles are various Indiana bat hibernation and maternity colony kind of information. The glacier is on the map. This is the grasslands map. And then that wetlands map. So I think that ultimately, I feel like this project was an amazing first step at this. In some ways, I feel like I really bit off more than I could chew. But at the same time, I'm really glad that I had this opportunity to really dive into a project and learn so much about something completely new. Ultimately, I'm not sure if the botanical illustrations really succeed in what I hoped to accomplish, which was basically creating botanical illustrations that emphasize complexity over individuality and perception over objectivity. But again, I think these are sort of a first step and a first attempt at that. And I'm really excited to take this project further and see where it goes, and work with more artists and writers and scientists on this project. So that's it. Thank you to everyone for coming and listening to me speak. I also wanted to give a huge thank you to everyone at the Lloyd for inviting me to do the residency in the first place, and then just being so supportive every step of the way. They were just, yeah, so knowledgeable and encouraging, and just a wonderful group to spend a month with. So thank you so much to Erin, Betsy, Christine, Patricia, Alex, and also a huge thank you to Eric Tepe for showing me the herbarium and helping with that aspect. And thank you to Rachel DeBoard for helping me print all the illustrations. These are my websites, if anyone's interested in looking at them. On my Instagram, I think there's like 8 things on there total, but you can still check those out. And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think there might be time for questions.
Audrey, thank you. That was fantastic. I know you said you're not sure that you achieved your goal of demonstrating the complexity from the viewer's standpoint, or this viewer's standpoint. You absolutely did. Your drawings, they're beautiful, but they're also so informative, and you gave us lots of things to think about tonight. One of the things that I wanted to share with the audience that may not be aware of this is that a medical illustrator has to go through a certain level of medical training, the scientific work, to become a medical illustrator. So there's the science and the art there from the very start. And with the work that you did, you can so clearly see your scientific knowledge, your artistic skills, and also the history. I love the way you weave the history in. So lots and lots of food for thought there. I have a question or two from your presentation. When you were talking about weeds, can you talk a little bit more about weeds and what weeds in your illustrations mean? Are they the same as invasive species, or are they what does somebody else doesn't want there? Or what do they mean to you in your illustrations?
Yeah, I mean, I think weeds can be invasive species, but I don't think they always are. I think a lot of times weeds are just anything that are not desirable in an agricultural setting or like an aesthetic garden kind of setting. But I think that I was interested in them in sort of what I was referring to early in the presentation when I was talking about usefulness. And I think that so many things are sort of approached from this perspective of how are they useful to the human project, and sort of viewing all life as just sort of being resources essentially for the human project, and not really thinking about, well, what is the use of them to other creatures, or just as a life form that exists on this planet and that we share this planet with. And so I was really interested in including things that have been defined as weeds in the illustration. And yeah, similar to that, I think that was a big reason that I included the lichens. I think that it's a kind of a similar idea where a lot of, they're sort of just seen as almost not even noticeable, or yeah, they just like don't really do much for humans, and yet like they're fascinating as a life form and clearly are essential to the environments they exist in.
And as you know, at the Lloyd Library, we share your love and fascination for mushrooms and fungi. So I was really pleased to see that. Well, moving away from weeds to worms, I didn't realize, that was news to me, that the worms that we see everywhere are not native.
Mm-hmm.
Did I hear you right? They're not native to North America. But yet I'm a gardener. I have the idea that worms in my compost pile and in my garden are a good thing. But a lot of times you hear if something is not native to a particular place, it doesn't have natural enemies, that sort of thing, it's problematic. So what's the word on worms? Is it a good thing?
I mean, I'm not a worm expert, but as far as I understand from the reading I've done on worms, yes, there are no native worms north of that glacial boundary. So it's not all of North America, but it is the glacial boundary in North America. And I think especially like the worm that I included in the illustration, it has been cultivated as these like, it's like humus, that's what it's called, right? In gardening, like build humus and aerate the soil and all that, which can be helpful in gardens. But apparently many North American forests evolved to have a lot of material on the ground at any given time. And I was reading and listening to some scientists and foresters talking about, you know, that when you walk through forests more and more, there's a lot of just bare soil on the ground, which is not necessarily how these different ecosystems evolved. And yeah, that's having a lot of impact on the amount of nutrients that are maintained in the soil at any given point. Yeah, like I was saying, soil quality and its ability to hold water, things like that. So yeah, apparently worms might not be doing great things for forests in North America.
That's really interesting. That was the first that I had heard that. There's so many directions you can go with your research, and you wove so many things into it. And I know this may not be a fair question to ask you, because it's kind of like asking somebody what their favorite movie or favorite book is or something like that. And so if you don't have an answer to this, it's fine. But when you were doing your research and you were looking through this historical information, was there something that struck you that was just an aha moment for you? That some new perspective or something you were unaware of, or that explained something for you?
I don't know if I have like an aha moment. I think that like part of doing this project is I really hope that it doesn't come across that I'm like trying to put forward some sort of grand theory of like, I figured I figured it out. And like, this is how the world is, or how we should relate to it moving forward. But I think that in researching the mushrooms, there were just so many moments of coming across species and species interactions that just were so mind-blowing, just in terms of what mushrooms can do. Both, there's like, as I was saying, like accumulating heavy metals from the soil. There's like mushrooms that can digest plastics. There's mushrooms that are like the size of like half of the state of Oregon or something like that. So they're underground mycorrhizal networks.
Sure.
And so I think there's just so many things. And I know that, learning about mushrooms, I feel like they're kind of gaining popularity. But I think there's just so many amazing lessons about just how complex life can be, and that there's things out there that just completely defy what we think of in terms of how other creatures act or what they're capable of. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to use that as a springboard to make a plug for the Lloyd, which is pretty much ground zero for mushroom information. So Audrey, thank you so much. It was a wonderful program. And I'd also like to thank the audience for being here tonight. And I also want to tell you to watch for a digital exhibition on our website with Audrey's work. So if you want to have some more time to sort of mull over some of these examples she showed tonight, that is coming. I would like to point out that programs like these and the Artist in Residence program are supported by Lloyd Library members. If you're a member of the Lloyd Library, thank you very much. If you're not, we certainly would welcome your joining. Also, if you are interested in the Artist in Residence program, we are accepting applications for the 2023 Artist in Residence. And you can find more information on our website, lloydlibrary.org, as well as the application that you can submit through the website as well. So thank you and have a good evening. Bye.